Welcome to Two Therapists Talking. The hope for this podcast is to talk about important issues related to couples and individuals who are struggling in their lives with many different issues. I'm David Thompson, a marriage and family therapist.
And I'm Sherie Christensen, marriage and family therapist. Please join us as we explore these issues together, and we hope you will learn and be enlightened along the way. Come find us at twotherapisttalking.com. If you like what you're hearing, please get on and rate us and subscribe to the podcast.
Hi, and welcome back to Two Therapists Talking. I'm David.
And I'm Sherie.
We are following up on the borderline personality disorder, or BPD, we talked about in the last episode, where we covered the symptoms and the criteria. And remember, 5 of 9 would basically be a diagnosis. We talked about the importance of a professional doing the diagnosing so that it's better, easier for everyone all around, for sure, in that situation. And you need the help anyway, because a lot of these symptoms are comorbid or overlap other things like depression. Mm-hmm. And grieving, mourning. So life experiences can be similar to this sort of thing. So it's just helpful to have somebody helping to determine that.
Yeah, definitely want to do that. Because again, with personality disorders, that's a pretty intense space, right? This is a long-term pattern of experience and behavior for that person that deviates markedly from the expectations of their culture. So it's going to be, and it has to be, borderline actually can be diagnosed prior to adulthood, but most personality disorders, they don't diagnose that. And they tend to shy away from that. They'll say, okay, well, we're looking at a lot of these tendencies, but oftentimes we'll wait until adulthood. But BPD can be diagnosed prior to that, as long as they've had at least a year of the symptoms in pretty intense way. So, but again, when we're talking about personality disorders, it's a big thing. And people can be on a spectrum, right? They can have traits or tendencies of this. So as we're looking at those diagnostic criteria that we talked about last time, of course, people can have a couple of those, or maybe they have some things, but they're not as maybe intense. Right. Because we really want to make sure we're allowing the diagnosis borderline to actually be what it is, just like NPD. Right. And we run around in our culture a lot, and these are kind of buzzwords, and we say this a lot, but we don't really understand, most people, what it actually means. And it really takes away, I think, from people who actually are struggling with those things. And our family members or have close relationships with people who are struggling with personality disorders when we use it so flippantly. Right. Probably number one, would you agree, is bipolar. If anyone ever gets really moody, it's like bipolar. Oh, yeah, you're bipolar. Not necessarily because they're moody. Right. So I hear that a lot. But especially in as we look at relationship and as we look at former relationships like divorce, NPD and BPD are the ones everyone says. Yeah. And so we really want to look at and make sure we're being aware of how we're talking about it, and that people are understanding what the criteria actually are, and being aware that, most people, if they have a high conflict personality, they're going to show up with some of the tendencies of these things, but a much fewer percentage are going to actually qualify for a diagnosis. Right. So with BPD, we're looking at a prevalence rate of about 1.6 to 5.9 of the population percent. So much smaller than how often you hear people talking about the people in their lives that are borderline, right? So again, those traits and tendencies, it's still important to understand and go, oh, okay, well, maybe this person in my life either has this or has a lot of these traits and tendencies, because then you can look up and get help for the patterns and what's going on. And again, just an awareness of if they have traits or tendencies, the things that you're going to do are going to be the same. They just may be less, or you may not need as many of them, if that makes sense. So you may need less emotional or physical space from them if they have traits or tendencies versus if they have a personality disorder. Does that make sense? Or at times as you're working with them. Or you may not, for example, with former spouses, if someone has a personality disorder, there's a much higher likelihood that a boundary that you're going to need in that relationship is not to communicate except in writing.
Right.
Because then you have the evidence of what's actually going on.
You've taken a lot of the emotion out of it.
And you absolutely have that opportunity to take emotion out of it as you're addressing them and working with them. So if they're on that spectrum, you may be able to communicate in person if you're working on custody or, exchange of kids or something like that, if this is an ex, right? Whereas otherwise you might really always have to have it in writing. So again, you're going to do the same thing. So understanding, oh, wow, they have a lot of tendencies in this area. You're going to look into those resources. You just may have a bit more or a lot more, depending on where they are in that scale, flexibility in terms of how much and how little you do.
Right.
And understanding too that, again, if you're going through stressful situations, like for example, a divorce, anyone gets more heightened in those situations.
Right.
Right. Anyone is struggling
That's normal.
more. Yeah, that's totally normal. And then if you have someone who has tendencies, they're going to be more, right? They're going to have a lot more stress in those types of situations. So a lot of times I think the reason why we have so many people that come in and, say, oh, my ex is a narcissist or my ex is borderline, is because they might have a few of those tendencies, but then under a lot of stress,
right,
it gets very exacerbated. But if you're willing to, like, maybe set some stronger boundaries or do some more intense things initially while they're heightened, then understanding they may come down and they really may not be as intense.
They may come out of it. Right?
Yes.
And it's not a pattern.
Because it's a stress-induced
right.
situation rather than a personality-induced situation.
Right.
So I think that's kind of important to think about and note. And also, again, to go back to when we're trying to understand people, right? When we really understand people, I don't know how many times we've said this. I say it almost every day.
What's coming? I don't know.
Yes. When we really understand people, if you really understand people, they make sense. And so a lot of what we want to do here is help you understand what's going on so that it makes sense and you know how to move forward. And so these patterns are important to note, and to note that, again, we talked about motive last time really briefly. Motive for borderline personality disorder is that fear
security.
Of abandonment and that security. So I guess, they have the fear of abandonment, and so they're looking for the motive is security. There we go. David had it right. And so, again, a lot of times I'll have spouses or other people that are involved in relationships with someone with BPD, and they will say, I don't understand it doesn't make sense. What they're doing doesn't make sense.
Really common thing to hear, actually.
Right. And so, but if you understand what that motive is and that they are people with borderline and any personality disorder, they're not bad people.
Right.
They just have a different capacity than what neurotypical people have.
Right. And usually fear of abandonment comes from actually having been abandoned.
Right.
And so, there's a story behind why they feel the way they feel.
Exactly. There's childhood stuff or other things that happened to them that were traumatic for them.
Lots of childhood experiences, And so our approach should be the same with all of these things, which is to try to understand, because then they make sense. And to be compassionate.
Yeah. While
maintaining, boundaries and things we'll talk about here. But it's always best to start that way, to think about their story and why they do what they do and why they need security. And almost as often as I think maybe this is the problem, if you ask about their background, they say, oh, all these things have been really hard for them. It's like, okay, that makes sense then.
It makes sense. Yeah. Yeah, I love what you're saying about having both and, like, being able to simultaneously hold space for they're not a bad person. They have these different capacities. They've already been through a lot, right? And so they're acting out of these self-preservation types of ways, or ways where they're trying desperately to get this need met.
Yeah.
That feels so big and so distressing to them all of the time. I mean, that's I find that a really easy place to be compassionate. Like, wow, that would be so hard
Scared
to feel
all the
like
time.
that all of the time.
Yeah.
And to constantly be feeling like you were going to be abandoned, and to constantly watch your affective instability push other people away.
Right.
Right. When you're so terrified that they're going to leave in the first place.
Right.
Like, that's really hard. And to be able to hold that compassion while also having the boundaries that you need, right? Because they're not bad, but what they're going through can very much cause them to act in ways that are painful or destructive to others as they're trying to navigate their needs.
Right.
So it explains, diagnosis, or these personality traits, it explains it, but it doesn't excuse the behavior.
Right.
Right. And so that can be a really tricky place for people to hold space.
Yeah.
And I think, too, kind of going back, we talked about the kind of societal way of talking about this cultural way of just, borderline. I feel like when we start throwing that around, it's typically used as an excuse. It's typically used as a, like, hey, this is what they have, so they're terrible and awful. And it's not used as a place of understanding and a place to come from for healing, and a place to come from in terms of forgiveness, right? And connecting. And so I love what you're saying about that and the importance of that compassion.
I mean, if you think of them as this little child when these initial, relationship injuries or attachment injuries occurred, how sad for them to be, 3 or 4 or 5 and abandoned. And so now here they are adults, but that fear of abandonment is very real. And that's sad that they feel that intensely about being alone, being rejected.
Yep. And I think, so as we talk about the healing and what to do moving forward, one of the great things, again, we talked about last time, is this diagnosis has such a great prognosis in terms of the personality disorders. So we were talking about personality disorders that comes from the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Disorders, right? DSM-5 we're in the 5th edition currently. And these are cluster B. Narcissistic personality disorder, borderline personality disorder are cluster B personality disorders, and those are related to the instability of affective and related relationship issues. So this instability and those types of things. And so that includes narcissistic personality disorder, it includes borderline personality disorder, it includes antisocial personality disorder, which doesn't mean not social. People think that all the time. It doesn't mean that. That would, again, the layperson term for antisocial personality disorder would be a psychopath, right? And includes histrionic personality disorder, which is one that has a lot of everything is very dramatic.
Attention seeking.
Attention seeking drama. Yeah. Again, so you can kind of see how there's overlap between some of these personality disorders and why it's so critical to get an actual clinical diagnosis when you're looking at these to get help. But of these and of the personality disorders in general, borderline has this fabulous prognosis comparatively. That they really can make quite a bit of change and shifting with help. And DBT and CBT are really, really good options.
So DBT is dialectical behavior skills, and CBT is cognitive behavior therapy.
And they even will have like clinics that specialize in
which is why
borderline.
Which is why we want a diagnosis to start. It can be really helpful.
Yeah.
Because then we know we need to seek more specialized help.
Right.
From clinics like this.
Mm-hmm. And they'll do just extensive DBT work or CBT work with clients. And so there are a lot of different options for support, options for help and therapy. And I mean, we mentioned last time that they've even had studies where you can actually get to the point where it's not even, you don't even meet all the full diagnostic criteria anymore.
You drop out of qualifying.
Yeah, which again is crazy for personality disorder. That's not normal. But again, it's a long-term process, right? Like this was like a 10-year study. But again, you know, there's hope, especially with this one, for change and for relationship and for healing.
Little disclaimer on that. So the challenge is, if you're a spouse listening to this, the challenge is to, and we'll talk about how to help your partner, let's say, who has BPD. The challenge is for you to also learn how to hold boundaries, how to act in ways that are a little bit different than what you normally would. Often, you know, there's pleasers who they enable this behavior, and the intensity is scary, and so there's never a challenge. There's never, not challenges in like a negative fight necessarily, just challenges in, hey, this is what's happening, this is what's going on.
Providing appropriate feedback.
Right. Usually it's just, you know, do whatever, say whatever to make it go away.
Yeah.
And to placate the person who is intense emotionally.
Yes.
And so it's not just going to be them using skills to come out of BPD, let's say.
100%.
They need a lot of help, and it'll be you coming out of your common patterns that may be less effective in keeping them where they're at too. Right. So that's the challenge often in this process, is everybody's got a
part to play.
Yeah. Everybody contributes. It's not as simple as go figure this out.
Right. Yeah. Everyone needs to kind of work together in the relationship. So once you have a diagnosis, or once you understand kind of the traits and tendencies, so where do we go with this? And we've talked about getting help for yourself if you're feeling like this is you, right? We've got DBT, we've got CBT options, but also relationship options. If you're in a relationship with someone, you want some specialized help with someone who understands the personality disorder and can help the two of you navigate that and work on relationship together. And especially you're going to need a specialized therapist for a couple of different reasons. One is so that they can help specifically with the different things that each partner will need themselves, right, and the relationship. Right. But also someone that can show up in relationship with a borderline, right, with a therapeutic relationship, because that is a much trickier relationship to navigate in terms of a therapeutic alliance. They have to be very careful and aware and making sure that they're creating an stability in the couple relationship and in the relationship with the borderline client, and making sure that they're feeling heard and seen. Right. And so there's a lot of extra work therapeutically that has to go into that space. It's not uncommon for people with borderline who are working with a therapist to have, again, some of those splitting situations where, oh, I come in and this is the best therapist in the world and they totally understand me and they totally, get me. And then they're challenged a little extra hard one time by the therapist, and then they're the worst and they're out and they don't want to see them anymore.
Which can be helpful if you can, to get a commitment of, say, 10 sessions. or 20 sessions before there's any changes, because you will be naturally inclined to just bolt and say they're either awesome, that's the idealistic part, and then total and complete, they don't understand, and this isn't going to work. So hanging in there, seeing it through is going to be important. So commitment is a big part of recovery, I've seen. So
right. So with relationship things and with what you need to do as an individual, if maybe someone you know has, or your spouse you may feel like has some of these tendencies and traits, David mentioned boundaries earlier, and that is a really huge thing. And we mentioned people pleasing, right? So oftentimes people who are in relationship with BPD individual they don't have boundaries, or they have very few boundaries.
Right.
Or they may be in the space where they have become a hypervigilant person to the emotions, to what's going on. We talked about this a little bit when we were talking about the diagnostic criteria last episode, where you just never know what's going to show up. And so you're just kind of walking on eggshells a lot, trying to navigate that. And oftentimes that comes for the spouse, that actually comes from older than the relationship.
Right.
They've come into the relationship with those tendencies, at least maybe a little bit, and then that gets really exacerbated by the relationship with the person with BPD.
Right.
And so doing your own work, like David was saying, like those things can end up enabling the BPD person and keeping them in their cycles and patterns, or at least helping them to remain in those patterns and cycles. So really doing your own individual work on, okay, I need to learn how to set clear boundaries and to follow through with those. And I need to be aware of my tendency to be hypervigilant, try to monitor and control what's going on for the other person so that I'll be okay.
Right.
And allowing different boundaries and things like that to come into play and be those protectors for you, instead of you're trying to control the other person to get that safety.
Right.
So one of the ways that may look is, if you remember, one of the criteria that shows up quite a bit is that suicidal threats or self-mutilation or attempts. And so a great boundary, whereas in the past you may have like, oh, I'll do anything, just don't, do anything, right? Or I'll acquiesce to whatever it is that you're saying, is to show up and take the threat very seriously.
Yeah.
Right? So instead of like, oh, I'll do whatever you want, just, come out of the bathroom and don't do anything.
Which means it worked.
Right.
For them, it reinforced.
Is to show up and say, like, this is so serious. Like, are you really serious? Because if you are, I'm definitely calling 911.
Yeah.
Right. And taking it really, really, really seriously. Like, let's make sure we get you help. Like, let's, call 911, have them come, maybe take you to the emergency room. Like, let's make sure that you are safe.
Yep.
Right. And that boundary can take away any potential manipulation that they might be using. Again, they're not doing it because they're bad.
Right.
They're doing it because there's so much distress and they're trying so hard to get their needs met. And this is the only way that they feel like they can.
Right.
And so, we're not slapping them on the hand and telling them, well, you're a horrible person because you're doing this thing. It's just, no, like, let's actually take that seriously.
Right.
And get you the help you need. And it takes that potentially manipulative element out of it.
Right.
And if they are really suicidal, then we're getting them the help they need, right? And we're not just kind of pushing it off because, well, this is the, fourth time this month that they've said that.
Right.
Right? You just, every time you want to take that really seriously and say, yes, if you are really serious, I'm definitely calling 911 to make sure that you're safe. And so that helps them and pulls out of that enabling space where then they have a little bit more space where they can look at, okay, what is this? So I've seen that happen where the the threats and that the borderline individual is making just drop dramatically, just pretty much out the bottom.
Yeah.
When when they're really held, when they're really taken seriously.
Right.
Because also, if you're really taking someone seriously, then they're like, okay, they're taking me seriously. So you're taking all of these, you're just really providing everything that's needed in that situation. So boundaries are really, really important.
Right. And, the cool thing is sometimes with borderline, you can talk directly about the need for security.
Yeah.
And try to connect everything back to that where
Yes.
It's like the way you're acting, the way you're sounding, what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's because you need to feel secure. You need to feel safe. You need to feel validation or approval or acceptance. Let's talk about that. Let's try to meet those needs in just a different way. Sometimes it works to be that direct.
Yeah. Yeah.
Depends on them and their mood and where they're at, but sometimes they can detach a bit and just look at their own behavior and say, okay, I can see how this might be a need for security. What can we do?
Right.
Instead of what I feel like doing,
right.
which is to be really angry or really manipulative in a way, the suicide stuff and everything else.
Mm-hmm.
And so how can we just slow everything down and address the real concern? So sometimes just we talk about this with NPD as well, but this BIF.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
What's BIF mean?
BIF stands for brief, informative, friendly, and firm.
So we communicate.
Yep. We communicate briefly. We don't go on and on because then there's too much information
Right.
and it can get twisted around and then we're back talking about something else that isn't a thing.
Right.
Informative, you're making sure you're giving them all the information that they do need. You're friendly, which is especially critical with borderline, right?
Don't fuel it.
I'm here, I'm there for you, all of that. But firm, like you actually have boundaries. And
Yeah.
again, that acronym comes from Bill Eddy. It's a book. There's a couple of them books that are called BIF, and it kind of teaches you how to do that process. So that's something, making sure that you're working on, again, your potentially enabling patterns,
Right.
people pleasing, hypervigilance, working on those boundaries for sure. And also another really important thing, I feel like we have a million things we could say and very limited time, but another really important thing is, as the spouse of a borderline, or, if you, someone with borderline personality disorder, I don't like saying it the other way, but if you're a spouse or in a close relationship, maybe you're a parent of, or something like that, it's really, 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 really important to be doing self-care, to make sure you're
Yeah.
taking time to rejuvenate yourself, because it's a lot to show up repeatedly and in these calm and loving ways.
Right.
With someone who is struggling so much that they're, very volatile and unstable in their moods and different things that are going on. It's hard. It's hard to show up all of the time, and you won't be perfect. You'll
Right.
definitely mess up a
Right.
lot, right? And then you'll need to fix it, right? That's just what we do. But the more that you are grounded and have taken care of yourself and are showing up for yourself, the more emotional space you'll have to interact.
Right. And you'll need it.
Yes. Yeah.
This is a non-negotiable if you actually want to help.
Right. Yeah. If you want to help, if you want to stay in a relationship, and if someone has a full diagnosis, like it's 100%. It's just a non-negotiable. And doing your own therapeutic work where you can release triggers and traumas that come up for you around it is going to be really important as well. So making sure that you have not just compassion for them and showing up in loving ways for them, but that you have a lot of self-compassion and show up in loving ways for yourself.
Right.
So those are a few things. I mean, I feel like we could talk for ages.
We really could. But this isn't meant to be comprehensive.
I know.
This is to give you some ideas.
But some just basic things to kind of look at and consider as you are working with someone who's on the spectrum or who has BPD. So thank you for joining us today.
Hope it was helpful.
Thank you for listening to Two Therapists Talking. We look forward to sharing more conversations with you. Connect with us at twotherapisttalking.com or email podcast@twotherapisttalking.com. If you like what you're hearing, please get on and rate us and subscribe to the podcast.